Dolmenwood Play Report, Session 3. This session was long and RP heavy. I think we only made one or two rolls outside of, standard procedures. That being said, the party made their first big moves in the wider world of Dolmenwood, so it was a really exciting session and a pretty important one too. We picked things up back at Prigwort. The party had just gotten back to town with some treasure recovered from the tomb of Sir Chide, but before they could sell it off, they needed to spend some time cleaning and restoring it. Centuries of grime and dust will really work a number on you. After a few days of cleaning, the party pays a visit to their new business partner, Haig, at the Sea of Stars to offload their goods for, I think the final tally was 4,000 gold total, so 2,000 gold each. Pretty good haul. So now the question was, how are they going to spend all their gold? They do all their standard shopping to re-up on supplies, food, torches, etc. But they do also buy a second horse to pull their cart, so they can now haul the full 100 slots of said cart, which is a huge upgrade, doubling their carrying capacity. Granted, 40 slots of that right now is just their gold, but still a nice upgrade nonetheless. The first main goal for the players is to start a business brewing turnip ale. It's the reason they went to Prigwort in the first place, and why we started our campaign here. After doing a little bit of math, the party realizes they can already afford to buy a building, or commission the building of one anyway. The party decides they want a two-story building, the bottom floor for their business operations, while the top floor would be their residence, home base, stuff like that. And it would come with an attic for storage as well. They have more than enough money for this build. The only holdup is acquiring permission to actually build it. The day-to-day operations and administration of Prigwort is done by a council of elevated brewer houses. Sort of nobles, sort of not, rich merchants, how it goes. But Prigwort itself is owned by House Harrimore, which is currently headed by Lady Theatrice Harrimore. So they'll need to convince one of these two parties for permission to actually build. Since Snood is a noble, squire, but still a noble, they decide to try their luck with Lady Harrimore first. So they travel over to Keep Harrimore, just 2 hexes north of Prigwort, and request an audience. The guards inform them that Lady Harrimore isn't normally hosting company at the moment, but since Snood is a noble, she will allow it. But Waffle, not being of noble blood, will have to wait in the courtyard with the cart and horses. Waffle isn't too happy about this, but it is what it is. So Snood goes to have a chat with Lady Harrimore and presents the strange blindfold recovered from Sir Chide's tomb as a gift. Lady Harrimore seems quite genuinely interested in it and hands it off to one of her servants after a thorough examination. The two converse about Snood's final trial as a squire and his request to build on some land in Prigwort for a business venture. Lady Harrimore shares her admiration for knights with varied and well-rounded interests and ambitions, but she cannot grant land to a squire, as frankly it would be a bad look. However, she proposes a deal to Snood. She mentions that her youngest daughter, Violet, has gone missing after a visit to the construction site on the new barracks at Prigwort along the western wall. She just can't justify sending her already limited resources for a full-on search for her daughter. The threats on her land from the Naglord and his crookhorns are just far too great and needs to be her first priority. But if a traveling knight, or in this case a squire, were to bring Violet home safely, she would be more than happy to write a letter to their lord thanking them for their contribution to House Harrimore, and perhaps even grant them some land as a thank you. Good news for Snood to hear. The two of them finish up their conversation. Snood gets back to Waffle and catches them up on the details, and they end up resting for the night at Keep Harrimore. The party departs at first light for Prigwort to begin their investigation. They start by questioning the construction crew, but they didn't seem to see or know anything and were more preoccupied on Lady Harrimore instead of her daughter. The party decides to split up and check out some establishments on the west side of town. Waffle checks out the Herbalist, while Snood heads towards the Oaf in the Oast Tavern. Waffle waddles on over to Wormpiddles to see if the owner, Edgar, knew anything. Ed mentioned that he found a huge black feather that looked similar to a giant crow feather, but was distinctly different. Edgar had no problem handing over the feather to Waffle, as long as they promised to mention that his shop helped with the investigation. Meanwhile, Snood is investigating the Oak in the Oast, a tavern and bathhouse on the west side of town. Talking to some local drunks didn't yield anything of use, so he asked the bartender instead. The bartender ended up directing him to one of his barmaidens, Jay, who shares that her son went missing a few weeks ago, around the same time that Violet Harriman also went missing. Jay recalls that she had sent her son, Bilberry, to fetch some firewood from the outside of their home, and he never returned. Jay also shared that she swore she saw him walking towards the west gate of town, but when she yelled out his name, he didn't turn around or acknowledge her at all, and he just kept walking. The two meet back up and share their findings and decide on an action plan. They decide to head west along the road out of Prigwar and do some sweeps of the area along the way. They start with the Prigwar Hex 1106, but they don't find anything. They continue on to Hex 1005 and do a search of the area and end up finding an abandoned shrine to St. Hollyhock. They aren't quite sure on how cool a find this actually is because they don't know any of the potential rewards for repairing the shrines. And honestly, that's probably my fault. These characters aren't super interested in religion anyway, so we'll probably end up saving this for a future cleric or friar to take care of for some future downtime projects. They end up camping here for the night and get an evening time encounter of 2d6 Sylvian centaurs, aka Fey centaurs. These are the nicer of the two centaurs to run into, but they still eat mortals as a treat, so they still need to be on their guard. Luckily, Waffle, while still immortal, is a demi-Fey and won the centaurs' favor by playing some music with them. The crew asks if the centaurs recognize the strange feather, and they confirm that they did, but they would only share if they were given the feather. Waffle, once again, already fed up with the so-called Fey bullshit, hands over the feather and learns that the feather, most likely, belongs to a Gloam, an undead, feathered, and beaked entity that often charms young children. Certainly fits the bill. The party, equally parts excited and concerned, asks the centaurs to join them in their quest to slay the Gloam, to which they respond with a jolly laugh and a stern, hell no, before carrying back on into the night. The party thinks of where they may run into a Gloam, being undead and all. A cemetery, perhaps? Abandoned crypts? Well, they do know that the abandoned Abbey of St. Cloud is nearby. Maybe the Gloam could be hiding out in there? They continue west along the road and are conveniently one hex away from the ruins of the Abbey, Hex 906. The ruined Abbey of St. Cloud is actually one of the Avengers included in the Kickstarter by Gavin Norman and Eve Gaines. But backers don't have access to the finalized PDF yet, since it's still being worked on and converted over to Dolmenwood. That being said, this adventure was originally published like 8 years ago as part of the original Dolmenwood Zine series. The Zine can't be bought anymore, I don't think, but I scrounged some YouTube for some screen grabs of the Zine version just to get the basis enough for the session today. This adventure dungeon is supposed to be for a party of level 4 to 6 characters, so it's way out of my player's league at the moment, especially for 2 of them. Heck, just the Gloam, which isn't even part of the actual dungeon, would be the strongest mob they would potentially encounter at all. But the party is feeling risky and motivated. They want to rescue Violet and the other children and get their land granted in Prigwar so they can carry on with their adventures. They first explore the graveyard, and while they don't find the children or the Gloam, they notice most of the graves have been carelessly dug up and their bones removed. Now the party splits up again, which this time terrifies me because I'm sure one or both of them are going to die. Luckily, I was wrong. Waffle heads to the bell tower, where the Gloam is, and ends up finding a missing boy on the second floor, sorting teeth into jars. He seems too old to be Bilberry, but when they try to communicate with the boy, and while he certainly acknowledges Waffle's presence, he doesn't respond at all. The boy also appears to have glassy eyes. Perhaps he's under some sort of charm by the Gloam. Waffle leaves to meet up with Snood, and thank gosh, because if Waffle went up, I think it was one more flight of stairs, they would have run into the Gloam and it would have been a death. So Waffle leaves to go meet with Snood, and thank gosh, because if Waffle went up one more flight of stairs, I think they would have run into the sleeping Gloam, potentially wake them up, and I just didn't want it to go down like that. I have no problem with player deaths, but you know, Waffle catches up with Snood right as he's about to enter the actual Abbot, the first floor anyway, and it's a complete disaster in there. Completely ransacked, totally destroyed. The party thinks about what could have possibly done this much damage to such an important building and so quickly. It's only a couple 100 years old, after all. But they really have no theory to go off of. Search around the ground level and don't find too much, mostly ruins, but they do run into who they assume is Violet Harriman, walking around the halls looking for more bones and teeth, presumably. Once again, Violet seems to hear and even acknowledge the party, but doesn't respond verbally at all, and has the same glassy eyes that the other kid did. Party takes a few moments to discuss their course of action. They have Violet, and that's the main reason why they came here. So they want to save the rest of the children too, but they still won't run to the gloom, which is another problem. Anyway, they conclude that if a whole group of centaurs didn't want to mess with the globe at all, then the two of them probably shouldn't either. Not without backup, at least. So the tentative plan is to get Violet out of there, force march back to Prigwort, specifically to the tower outside of Prigwort, which would end up causing exhaustion, and then send a messenger that night back to the keep to let Lady Harrimore know that Violet is safe. But how are they going to get Violet back to the cart? Snood says, screw this, and just grabs Violet by force, and she starts screaming violently. Waffle stuffs her mouth so she can't yell as loudly, and the two just haul ass back to the cart, tie her up with rope, and head back to Prigwort immediately. Violet eventually stops wiggling and screaming, but still doesn't try to talk to the party at all. Once the party gets back to Sweeney Tower, they state their business to the guards out front and are greeted personally by the woman in charge, Hilda Harrimore, commander of the Order of St. Sedge, and younger sister to Lady Harrimore. So Violet's on. The party gives her all the details while Hilda inspects over Violet for any injuries, malnutrition, stuff like that. Then personally escorts the party back to the keep that night along with 2 other clerics. Violet is safely returned home. The next day, the party, this time both Snood and Waffle, are called to an audience with Lady Harrimore, who personally thanks both of them for their swift action rescuing her daughter, as it helps clear her mind to focus on defending her lands from the Nag Lord. She also presents to Snood a letter addressed to Lord Ramus, commending Snood for her swift and heroic deeds in aid of House Harrimore. While the party doesn't know for sure, they hope this letter will help Snood's case for knighthood. We wrap the session up with Waffle and Snood spending a couple of days eating and resting up at Cape Harrimore while they decide on their next course of action. And that's where we left off. One of the things I like best about using a big hex map and setting like Dolmenwood is that it's detailed out enough for me to improvise based off of my players' wants. I didn't plan out this session at all. When I did my research and grabbing screenshots of the adventure, I was doing that mid-session. The players decided they wanted to pursue acquiring land now, something I thought would be a more longer-term goal for them, but they were interested in it now, so we went for it. Considering the avenue they took, rescuing the daughter of the head of a noble house, well, that seemed worthy of getting some land, so I just used that as a hook and rolled with it. Running a campaign like this has been a big change of pace for me and my players. It's very different, but very fun to just know the world and react to the players' actions. I mean, look, this is pretty common advice for GMing anyway, to avoid railroading. But the way I did this in the past was on an arc-by-arc basis. But I'm not planning arcs or trying to explicitly set up what comes next. I'm just dropping rumors and hooks once in a while as I roll them and improvising based off what my players do and the way the dice fall. To be fair, it certainly helps that my players are open to play a game like this. It's definitely not for everybody. Most of the games we've all played or ran in the past have been arc-by-arc, linear, story-focused campaigns. Not that that's a bad thing. Everyone is trying new stuff here, and everyone's having a great time so far. That's all for this week. We've actually already played our next session, and I'm already working on the script for that episode. We finally got our 3rd and 4th players at the tables, and I can't wait for you to meet them. Happy New Year, and have a good one.